So I'm in Washington Park in front of Cincinnati's Music Hall, where the opera and the symphony come out for this annual event to sing for a bunch of locals. It's a lot of fun, and it's a little complicated. So Washington Park has been sort of at the center of a debate in recent years about whether turning public property over to private organizations results in urban renovation that benefits everyone, including the low-income people that have struggled in neighborhoods like Over-the-Rhine for decades, or whether it leads to gentrification, the sort of indirect pushing out of low-income folks by selling off cheap property and bringing in more middle and upper-class housing and businesses. I really like opera. I love classical music in general, and it's great that an event like this is free and open to the public. But I find it interesting that, of all things, a classical music concert being held here, of all places, on this well-landscaped emblem of a ongoing debate about the public good at the intersection of race and class. This isn't just a field of grass and people, it's a field of cultural struggle on the level of symbol. If I asked you what sort of music you like, would opera be high on your list? I mean, do you go out of your way for a good opera gig? Okay, whatever type of music you like, why do you like it? And you might be saying something like, well, I don't know, I just like it. It's subjective, right? This is what's just called the ideology of charisma, because it assumes that your cultural tastes are innate, the product of nature. I just like opera. I just like country music. I don't really. It's called an ideology because even though this is what we tell ourselves, what's actually contributing to our tastes is a little more complicated. Okay, let's go inside. It's like literally a million degrees out here. In his book, titled Distinction, sociologist Pierre Bourdieu set out to account for why we have different cultural tastes. And he concluded that to a large extent, our tastes in art, music, literature, and other cultural products is predisposed in us by our upbringing and our education, both functions of our social origins and class. Taste becomes a sort of social implement that people use to distinguish high from low, legitimate culture from illegitimate culture, with all sorts of stuff. Food, drink, makeup, clothes, books, music, news channels, you name it. Within what Bourdieu calls the field of cultural consumption, we're all vying for bits of cultural capital. Bourdieu explains that, for example, a work of art has meaning and interest only for someone who possesses the cultural competence, that is, the code into which it is encoded. Thus, the encounter with a work of art is not love at first sight, as is generally supposed, and the act of empathy, which is the art lover's pleasure, presupposes an act of cognition, a decoding operation, which implies the implementation or use of a cognitive acquirement, a cultural code. This code, he writes, called culture, functions as cultural capital owing to the fact that, being unequally distributed, it secures profits of distinction. Distinction, that is, between high and low, good culture and bad culture. The amount and type of cultural capital you acquire, the understandings that you know how to encode and or decode, determines sort of where you fall within this multicultural field of power relations. If you've ever been the only person among your friends not to get a work of modern art, then you know what this looks like. Conversely, have you ever tried to sound smart during an Avengers movie by pointing out that the appearance of characters across properties is an example of literary intertextuality? I bet you will now. We learn how to move within these cultural fields from the time we're kids. Each of us embody what Bourdieu calls a habitus, a set of habits, attitudes, and predispositions that we pick up from our education and our environment. And these trigger our judgments and perceptions within specific fields. Our habitus is what causes us to make value distinctions between different cultural and symbolic goods. And according to Bourdieu's research, these distinctions, to a large degree, can be predicted along class lines, serving to perpetuate socially constructed values and distinctions between classes. It's habitus that makes a classical music fan cringe when she hears hip-hop, that makes my grandparents look puzzled at a piece of minimalist painting, and that makes a distinction between foods like beef and, well, not beef.
Nice thing about sirloin, makes the whole brain happy. Beef, real food for real people.
Real people. Speaking of taste, have you eaten any good books lately? The metaphor of eating books goes back a few years, a few thousand. In an essay for Aeon, literary scholar Louise Adams charts the history of this metaphor, writing that, at least since biblical times, quote, reading's connection to eating has reflected its centrality to social power and responsibility. She writes that in Renaissance Europe, while this eating imagery was sometimes used to distinguish between kinds of books, as in Francis Bacon's famous line, some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, most of these cases were primarily used not for distinguishing among books, but between different kinds of readers. As with cultural capital in Bourdieu's theory, this metaphor was weaponized to praise or denigrate how people responded to cultural objects. Adams writes that by the 1700s, writers began to distinguish between appetite, the connection between reading and the body, and taste, connection between reading and the mind. Hobbesian philosophy had depicted humanity as a cesspit of ungoverned appetite, and the poetry of Restoration court culture made the bodily realm seem crude. Against these forces, the civilizing discourse of taste was marshaled. Appropriate literary desire was reimagined as a matter of the palate. Good reading became a sanitized activity, common to polite community. Those who craved, gobbled, and devoured texts were, by implication, vulgar. By the 1980s, the negative eating metaphor fizzled out, social values having changed for the most part, and the metaphor became a positive one. Nowadays, it's a good thing to devour lots of books. Any reading is good reading. But Adams is skeptical of this, and I think rightly so. Like I've talked about previously on this vlog, there are different modes of reading, and some may be better for us than others. And for Adams, this leveling of the reading field is sort of problematic. She writes, if a book grips us, if it sucks us in like a Hollywood thriller, it's doing its job. Any work that elicits a slower, more ruminative reading experience is cast as defective. But of course it could be said that this is inevitable with cultural capitalism. As long as there are distinctions to be made, there is symbolic power to be gained, and produced and sold for economic capital. This is just the sort of thing that critical theorists Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer argue in their book Dialectic of Enlightenment, criticizing what they call the culture industry. Within this scheme, the unequal distribution of capital means that business, particularly producers of culture, can capitalize on our cultural demand. Those with the money and the best market research will do whatever they can to maintain and/or shape dominant aesthetics to better predict and take advantage of our pursuit of cultural and social capital. Magazines, movies, media of all kinds do a great job of signaling to us what we ought to consider legitimate culture, and give us tips often on how to approach it, which usually means buying something. This is summed up by Adorno and Horkheimer when they describe how the culture industry is always working to make these cultural distinctions appear natural and given. They write, the principle dictates that the customer should be shown all his needs as capable of fulfillment, but that those needs should be so predetermined that he feels himself to be the eternal consumer, the object of the culture industry. Which brings us to the big finale. The process of forever being shown what your options are when it comes to cultural consumption means that they're presented as inherently thus, simply the way things must be. Bourdieu calls this a misrecognition. When we say, I don't really know much about art, I just know what I like, we mistake knowledge as being equal to culture rather than a sort of object itself, a piece of capital, a code that one appropriates not by virtue of anything innate, but by the structures into which we were born and raised, whose symbolic value derives less from something inside it and more from social construction. We mistake for natural what's in fact arbitrary, which is why it seems important to realize, at least in a more accurate way than we may sometimes do, that culture is intertwined with power relationships, and those relations aren't necessarily natural, but created and maintained. Maybe this can open us up more to appreciating a greater variety of aesthetics and communicate more clearly about art and music and literature than we sometimes do. Or at least it can maybe help us not be such snobs about things. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope that was interesting and thought-provoking. Some extensive ground I wanted to cover for this one. So I've got works cited below in the description, as I've always done. If you liked what you watched today, please hit subscribe and tell all your friends on Twitter or Reddit or whatever you're on. Even in person, just walking down the street, just say, hey man, have you checked out the Electric Didact vlog? I mean, it's awesome. Yeah, so, pull your cultural capital card. In other news, Heather, my wife, has started a YouTube channel of short science songs. In fact, it's called Super Short Science Songs. So you should check it out. There's a link here and in the description below. They're pretty great. She's planning on doing several this summer. We're just a budding YouTube family.